I get a lot of questions about how to write goals for language therapy. And I also get a lot of questions about whether I offer a language therapy goal bank. Here's why I don't do that. So, first of all, I think it's really important to just say that I understand why people ask for these types of things. I think with language therapy, it's kind of a big, broad area. It can be really difficult to know where to start. So, I can see why goal banks can seem appealing because you want to just kind of have some kind of a tool that makes it easier for you to do your paperwork. But I actually don't recommend using a lot of the standard goal banks out there that have tons and tons of goals, and they have a lot of discrete skills. And the problem with that is that when you're relying on a lot of those goal banks, it takes the problem solving process out of writing the goals, and the goals end up being kind of rote and contrived and not very functional. So I actually recommend that you do something else. And depending on what you're working on, depending on if you're working on language skills, if you're focused on academic skills, if you're focused on executive functioning, if you're focused on the school setting versus the home setting, how you write goals is very different. So without that context, your goals aren't really going to make a lot of sense. So that's why it's more important to have more of a goal writing process than to actually write or use goal banks. If you just use those goal banks, a lot of times they're not taking that context into account and your goals aren't going to be very functional. Now, I do have kind of a set of principles that I use for writing goals. I know a lot of you have heard of the SMART format where you're writing goals that are specific and measurable. But the way that we actually apply that format, the way that I see it, is a little bit different depending on whether you're working on a very tangible academic language skill versus a more functional skill, like something that might tie in a lot of executive functioning. So I see those things as a little bit different. And so when we're using something like the SMART format, I think it's very different depending on those types of skills, depending on if you are working on the skill or if you're working on the strategy, because there's a place for both. They're both important, but how you would write a goal for one or the other is very different. And it's important to understand the difference. So I actually recently recorded a podcast episode on the Are They 18 Yet podcast where I dove into how I do this for language and what my goal writing process is. You can actually go to my website if you go to drkarendudek-brannan.com /blog. If you go to episode 68, in this episode, I talk about why I don't use language therapy goal banks and what you can do instead. So if you go to that website, again, that's drkarendudek-brannan.com /blog and go to episode 68. That is where I talk about language therapy goal banks. You can actually subscribe to the Are They 18 Yet podcast on most podcast directories and search for episode 68 to learn more about this.